Hi, Robby.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm well. How about you today?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and on audio podcasts. You are Robert George, well-known conservative intellectual, professor at Princeton. In fact, I think your title is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton. You also run the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, which is kind of relevant to what we're going to mainly talk about. We're going to mainly talk about what is sometimes called the free speech problem on college campuses. Some people characterize it that way. I think you might characterize it more broadly as a kind of an open-mindedness problem. But in any event, I want to start by talking a little about Donald Trump, because you and I talked about that last time we had one of these conversations. I also think I should tell people how we came to have this conversation. I was walking down the street at twilight. It was getting dark.
That's right.
I saw a car that did not have its headlights on. It had its parking lights on, but it was, in my judgment, too dark to rely only on parking lights. So being the good citizen I am, I tried to point, the car was stopped at a red light, tried to point at the headlight so the driver would realize what the problem was. The driver did not understand, and the driver rolled down his window and asked me what the deal was. As it happens, you were the driver.
That's correct.
And we wound up...
The ultimate absent-minded professor. Don't even have enough sense to...
Actually, my theory after the fact is that it was all a ploy to get on my show.
Oh, I see. Okay. I've been discovered.
But in any event, people should know that it does work. If you want to be on the show, just drive it at night with your headlights off.
You were being more than a good citizen. You were being a good Samaritan.
Well, I don't know. It didn't really come at much cost to me. I mean, actually, a good Samaritan, that's not irrelevant to what we're going to talk about ultimately, because the price the Good Samaritan paid would have been blowback from his tribe, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right. Exactly right.
It's relevant to the tribalism, the ideological tribalism problem we will be getting into.
I think that parable from Jesus is really all about tribalism.
Yeah.
The tribalism on the Jewish side, the tribalism on the Samaritan side. And Jesus said, look, we're going to overcome this.
Right.
The Good Samaritan takes care of the Jewish traveler. The Jewish traveler is grateful to the Samaritan at a time when Jews and Samaritans wouldn't cross the street to say hello to each other.
Right. So the Good Samaritan is not just a good citizen or compassionate person. He is anti-tribalism.
Yeah, he recognizes the humanity of the other. That's the key thing.
Yeah.
There's something more fundamental than our tribal membership, and that's our common humanity.
Right. So, but quickly on the Trump front, when we spoke after Trump had been nominated, but before he had been elected, at that point, you were saying that notwithstanding the fact that you're a conservative, you could not support Trump. Now, a number of people who said things like that at the time have since he was elected president, become less critical, if not out and out supportive of him. Certainly some politicians, but also some intellectuals. So I was wondering if your position has evolved.
Well, no, and it's not quite right to say that I opposed him notwithstanding my being a conservative. I opposed him because I was a conservative.
Mm-hmm.
What Trump represented to me is really antithetical to basic conservative principles. Now, I couldn't bring myself to support Hillary Clinton either, and for the same reason. As a conservative, I'm not going to support somebody whose fundamental values I do not share. But that was an election when I didn't have a candidate I could support. So on my personal ballot here in Princeton, I actually wrote in the name of a politician who does share my values, or whhose values I share, and that's Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska. Huh. No, I haven't changed my mind about Donald Trump. My fundamental concern really was with his character, because I think character really matters to leadership. Back in 1998, when I and lots of other conservatives tried to tell our progressive fellow citizens character really counts, character really matters in leadership. Mm-hmm. Bill Clinton's poor character makes him a bad leader. I meant it. And I'm a little disappointed now that so many of my conservative friends who were talking in 1998 the way I was talking in 1998, in 2018 are not talking the same way. They're overlooking the deep character flaws we have in the current president of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to say nothing that Donald Trump does is good or could possibly be good. Here's my position, Bob, and I said this the day after the election. He's the president. He's our president. I said the same thing about Barack Obama. I didn't support him. I didn't vote for him. But once he's elected, he's all of our president. He's our president. And so I think with a president, leader of our country, we should support him when we can and oppose him when we must. And that's exactly what I've done. I've supported him when I can, and I have opposed him when I must. I've had to oppose him on immigration policy, on separation of families, on the travel ban. Those are areas where I think his policies are wrong and in many cases deeply unjust. Got to oppose him. On some other things, including his judicial appointments, which I think are good, and I've been actually surprised at how reasonable and responsible and good they are. I've supported him because I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would guess that for some of the people you're talking about who, to your disappointment, have warmed up to him, this is a big issue that has changed their minds. Court picks are very important to some people, especially the religious right. I guess you are in one sense on the religious right, but not the conventional sense. I mean, you're Catholic, you're not evangelical, but some of the same.
Yeah, but I have a lot of respect for evangelicals. I work closely with evangelicals. I'm not a person who's going to denigrate evangelicals.
No, I didn't mean that. I just meant you're not the stereotypical member of the religious right. People think of evangelicals, I think, largely when they think of that.
That could be, yeah. I'm a Catholic, and there's a whole philosophical tradition there that I draw very heavily on. So I see the difference that you're.
Well, certainly on Roe versus Wade, I mean, most conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics would agree.
Yeah, that's right. They'd agree on that, but they'd probably disagree on a lot of other things.
Can I ask you? This is kind of trivial, but as long as we're on the subject, so the latest Supreme Court pick, Kavanaugh, he did something when at the ceremony where he was nominated. He said something that I thought was very odd, and it got a lot of attention. Which is, he said, no president in history has done such a thorough job, consulted with so many people in choosing his Supreme Court nominee. And I thought two things. That's a little self-flattering to say that you are the result of the most systematically meritocratic process ever devised by humankind. But I also thought, I mean, if you're going to be a Supreme Court justice, I would think you should pay a lot of attention to the truth of assertions you make. And how could you conceivably know that that's true?
Well, here's what I'd say about that. Donald Trump is a transactional politician. Right. He's the ultimate transactional politician. A lot of politicians are transactional, but this guy's the platonic form of the transactional politician. He's at the polar extreme opposite of the convictional politician. So if somebody like Reagan or FDR is a convictional politician, although they were more transactional than people tend to think. Still, if there are models of convictional politicians, then Trump is our model of a transactional politician. And he made a promise to conservatives, and that promise really had to do with you guys get the judiciary, and he's delivered the judiciary. Now, I have to say, Bob, I'm such a skeptic, and I am so skeptical, particularly of Trump's character and truthfulness, that I did not expect him to keep his word. I thought when push comes to shove, the kinds of judges he'll appoint will be the guy who handled his brother-in-law's divorce case, or the guy who did the permitting on the golf course in South Carolina, or something like that. But what he did was something, and this might be what Kavanaugh had in mind, what he did was something rather interesting. He got in touch with the leadership, the intellectual leadership of the conservative legal establishment. Trump's an anti-establishment kind of guy, but for transactional reasons, he developed relationships with the leadership of the conservative legal establishment. And he said, you guys work with me and give me the best people you have. This is not going to be his brother-in-law's divorce lawyer or the guy who did the permitting on the golf courses in South Carolina. They did that. Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, Ed Whalen of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and a few others worked with him or worked with his White House staff on a list of nominees or potential nominees that any Republican president would be proud to appoint. This guy surprises me, I have to say. And Trump, because I guess it has worked for him politically, has kept his word. Now, I don't think he kept his word just to keep his word, because he's not the kind of guy who keeps his word just to keep his word. He's kept his word because it's working for him politically. It's holding the conservative base because he is delivering the judges. Now, as it happens, I like those judges. These are people that I wish George W. Bush would appoint or Ronald Reagan would have appointed. They're not the kinds of people I expected Trump to appoint. I don't know Kavanaugh personally. We've probably shaken hands once or twice. I know his record. He's a distinguished jurist. He's highly credentialed. He's got a judicial temperament. He's got all the qualities. He's a mainstream conservative constitutionalist jurist. I do know Neil Gorsuch very well. I've known Neil for years and years. We both did our doctorates at Oxford under the same scholar, John Finnis. We're at different times, but we're part of that same community. He did his book in the series that I edited at Princeton. It was a book on assisted suicide and euthanasia. And it was published under my editorship in the series that I edited at Princeton University Press. Well, you just, on the conservative side, you don't get a better jurist than Neil Gorsuch. He's what Elena Kagan is on the progressive side. Mm-hmm. Elena Kagan's a mainstream progressive, very distinguished, very smart. Neil Gorsuch is a mainstream conservative, very distinguished, very smart. So this is an area in which you've got to give Trump credit, whatever his transactional reasons are, and I have no doubt they're nothing but transactional. He's doing the right thing.
I think you're right that he's very focused on consolidating the base, and I assume he became more so as it became evident early on in his administration that there was serious talk of impeachment. Because if you hang on to your base, you can't get impeached. You need a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And so I think he started off with a kind of a defensive strategy, retreating to the base. And now he's, doing what he can with that. I think it's not at all impossible that he could be reelected. But I agree with you that I wasn't, like you, I wasn't sure what he would do in these various areas. And it's interesting because in principle, he could have become a more transformative figure, at least in the sense of being more of a challenge to the two-party system than I think he currently is. You can imagine him, suppose he had gone more with kind of the lifestyle libertarians who are actually well represented in the alt-right and in a lot of his base.
Absolutely right.
And gone, rather than go with the religious right, and suppose he had moved left on some economic policies that would take care of the white working class, among other people.
Well, that's one thing he is doing.
Well, with trade, but it's not with, I wouldn't say it was an especially, working class friendly tax cut. They got a little money, but it was more a tax cut for the, tax
cuts are always going to favor people who make more money, but I think it's the
not always. I could invent one that wouldn't.
Well,
want to hear it?
The tariff policy, the trade policy flies directly in the face of conservative tradition, of Republican orthodoxy. It's closer to Bernie Sanders' position than to any modern Republican's position. And, now I think there are some adverse consequences of that for parts of Trump's base. I think it's going to hurt him with Midwestern farmers and people who rely on the farm economy, but it's helping him with steel workers and coal miners and people like that.
Well, he's now making up for that with welfare for farmers, and also it sounds like he's trying to make peace with the Europeans on the tariff front. But I guess what I have in mind is if you look at Steve Bannon's critique of Trump, he said things like, "I would have raised taxes on the rich. I would have gone and cut them more on the poor. I would have gone full. He would have gone more leftist populist than Trump has gone, and I think that would have presented more of a challenge to the two-party system. I think Trump potentially represents the destruction of the current party alignment, but I think the way
that's what Bannon wants. I agree. That's what Bannon wants. That's right. Bannon's disappointed in Trump because he hasn't actually gone nearly that far.
Right.
Bannon wants him to go that far.
Right. So anyway, that's Trump. Anything else you want to say about Trump before we move on to the climate discourse on campus?
Well, only that I think you're probably right that there's a significant chance that he could be reelected. The economy is booming now. That could change. Anything could change. The Russian collusion thing could suddenly turn something up. It doesn't look so far. Nothing's turned up that's really put him in any danger. But something could turn up. Who knows? But if you look at where he is right now, even though his polling numbers are not great, they're never great. They weren't great when he was elected. But if you look at where things are now, it seems to me entirely possible that that he could be reelected. I'm very surprised to hear myself saying that. I
think he's better prepared to withstand anything damning that Mueller comes up with than he was 6 or 8 months ago or a year ago, because he has succeeded in deepening the tribal divide.
Absolutely.
And convincing a lot of people in his base that you should not believe anything you hear anywhere except maybe Fox News.
It's even stronger than that, I think, Bob. Not only has he convinced people in his base of that, he's driven the Democratic Party and the progressive movement further leftward. There are things that not only Bill Clinton said, say about immigration, the things that Barack Obama said that would get you drummed out of the conservative movement today as being a right-wing extremist racist. He's got people clamoring for the abolition of ICE. Now I've been critical, as you know, of Trump's immigration policy and especially the separating of families and of some of the way ICE has operated. But you are not going to win the presidency if you're the Democratic Party if your platform implicitly or explicitly includes things like eliminating ICE. So I think in driving the Democrats further leftward and consolidating the tribalism of the Republican Party, he's actually setting himself up, I hate to say this, for success.
Yeah, I agree that even though I think there are versions of abolish ICE that would replace it with something else that may make policy sense, but I think as a talking point, it's not smart politically. I also think he's gotten to a point. I mean, I've long been saying that the so-called resistance is getting too outraged, too reflexively outraged for its own good, because sometimes the outrage assumes a form that actually helps strengthen his base and confirm his narrative that, everyone hates him and looks down on his base and so on. But I think it's almost gotten to the point where it actually doesn't matter what form the outrage assumes. Just any kind of, I started thinking this after the Russia thing, when I thought, well, we'll see how this plays out. It may actually not hurt him with his base, even though it looks pretty bad. Well, if anything, it wound up helping him. His ratings, if anything, went up. And I just thought, and there was an unprecedented almost level, uniformly high level of outrage. It even extended a little bit into Fox News. So I just think outrage period helps him now, maybe.
Well, especially when the outrage is directed at Trump's own base of supporters. You direct your outrage, you express contempt for the people where I grew up in West Virginia or in Southern Ohio or in Eastern Kentucky or in Indiana or up in Michigan. You express contempt for those people. You smear them as racist and so forth and so on. All that's going to do is tighten his grip on them. And he's kind of playing the left for fools on that. Yeah.
No, he's been in his own ways. I continue to believe he's no genius, but there is there's some kind of savvy at work here, whether he understands it or not.
Yeah, I thought the same thing myself, that it's not what we usually think of as genius. It's not an intellectual thing. It's kind of an instinct that he has, that he is able to cause people to hurt themselves,
to overreact, and he instinctively appeals to the worst in human nature, and in the current climate, that seems like it'll get you a long way.
I'm afraid that's right, and and he brings out the in a way the worst in people on both sides.
Yeah. So anyway, this is not. If we wanted to make a segue to the campus speech issue, I guess we would note that on campuses there are certain forms of kind of tribalism that are arguably manifest. I imagine. Well, let me set the stage. First of all, you. Like a number of people in academia, maybe more on the right than on the left, but certainly not only on the right, are unhappy about the climate on college campuses, including things like deplatforming speakers, speakers who are considered outside of the ideologically acceptable range, who, if they come on campus, will run into so much trouble that they'd rather not come. There will be protests. There was one famous kind of physical assault at Middlebury. And then separate from that, I was reading your congressional testimony on this, and then separate from that, you're calling attention to a more long-standing complaint from the right about just the ideological composition of college faculties. And I guess you think these problems are not entirely unrelated, but in any event, something has been created called Heterodox Academy, consisting of academics who are fighting this problem as they see it. You are a member. In fact, you recently got an award along with Cornel West, who is, of course, well-known leftist thinker, and with whom you've taught a seminar at Princeton. And I guess,
yeah.
And did the two of you, I don't know if it was in the wake of Middlebury or what, did you formulate this statement, the kind of about intellectual tolerance that then got a lot of academics to sign on to it?
We did, yeah. Brother Cornell and I put out a statement called Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression. And it was really a plea for what you might call old-fashioned liberal academic values, listening to each other, considering sympathetically arguments across a spectrum of points of view, being willing to confess one's own fallibility, really listening, not just hearing and allowing people to talk. Anybody can do that. We need to do more of it, but anybody can do that. Hearing. Listening is the key thing, actually considering sympathetically what people who disagree with you have to say. That was our plea, and we made the argument not that that we should honor these values because fairness requires it, though in a certain sense it does. More fundamentally, we should honor these values because democracy requires it and because the truth-seeking mission of educational institutions requires it. This is not a let's be fair to conservatives point. It'd be nice to be fair to conservatives. I'd appreciate it if people on the left would be fair to conservatives where people on the left are in the overwhelming majority as they are on college campuses. But that's not fundamentally what the plea is. Mm-hmm. The plea is if you want to do education, you really need a spectrum of points of view that can be articulated and defended by thoughtful people on the campus. And if you're running an echo chamber or a bubble, students are not going to get the benefit of an actual education. They're just going to be reinforced in what they already believe. A party line will be imposed. You're not going to get genuine critical thinking. And although Cornell and I are on opposite sides in the ideological debates, we completely agree in sharing these old-fashioned liberal academic values.
Mm-hmm. Now, as it happens, most of the, I think most of the professors who are really active in this are people who have gotten a certain amount of blowback themselves on campus. It has tended to come from the left because the left is more active. The kind of derogatory label for these leftist activists on campus is social justice warriors. I'm wondering, Cornell, of course, would not get blowback from the left by and large, I guess. He has gotten some blowback from on issues he's expressed about Israel, where he's on the left. And I'm wondering, Heterodox Academy, I think, wants to emphasize that it is not right or left, that it just stands for principles. I'm wondering, have they taken any stands about speech codes that were right-wing speech codes that were violated as opposed to left-wing?
Yeah, they are an equal opportunity critic of running universities as catechism classes. So they believe, and I believe, and this is why I'm a member, that any good university is going to let 1,000 flowers bloom, let a very, very wide range of viewpoints be represented, encourage actual disagreement. A majority of members of Heterodox Academy are progressive.
Is that right?
Yeah, a majority are progressive. They've done polls. A substantial minority are people like myself who are conservative, but the majority are progressive. And at their first conference, and that's the conference as you kindly mentioned, Cornell and I were given their inaugural leadership award. At the conference, the participants were the vast majority. The vast majority, wasn't just a narrow majority, were on the progressive side. If you looked at the speaker list, people like Emily Yaffe and Alice Drager, but many of them, though progressives, had gotten into trouble for even tiptoeing up to challenging some progressive dogmas.
Right.
So it wasn't just people like me who are on the conservative side who are openly in rebellion against the liberal orthodoxies. It was even people like Alice Drager who, vote for Hillary Clinton and believe in nationalized health care and all that stuff.
Right. But I guess that's my question. There's some who have gotten in trouble for tiptoeing up to right-wing. I mean, for example, there was this guy, I forget the college. He had tweeted something. I forget, was he himself? He was himself, I think, was Palestinian. You'd know of the case, I think, because he was denied. Tenure had been offered in a letter, and it was withdrawn because of something he had tweeted about Israel. He argued for one interpretation of what he had tweeted. Other people argued for it. But in any event, the tenure offer was withdrawn after, I think, pressure from a member of the Board of Trustees or something.
And that's an example of a guy on the left to whose defense Heterodox Academy rushed.
It did.
Because he was being his academic freedom, right to express his point of view, although he was doing it, in quite aggressive language, but nevertheless, it still deserved to be respected and not make him subject to disciplinary proceedings. His rights were being violated. So people like me and the people in Heterodox Academy said, hang on, I don't agree with this guy, but we've got to defend his right to free speech, not only because he has that right, but also because if you want universities to be educational institutions and not echo chambers or catechism classes, you've got to let dissenting voices be heard, and not only heard, but as I say, listened to. Okay.
Do you have a theory about why students are so much more vocal about ideological things than they were 20 years ago? And in some cases, kind of, aggressively. I mean, I also want to talk about how widespread the problem actually is, how many campuses it afflicts and so on. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my only thought is that people have a need for meaning. People search for meaning. It's the human condition. And what I see now on campuses in a lot of cases, and this isn't just students, but a lot of faculty members as well, where perhaps in earlier times, even recent earlier times, religion would have, religion in the traditional sense would have supplied meaning. People who are not religious in the traditional sense look for meaning somewhere else, and often they look to it in politics. And just as religion always creates the danger of dogmatism, I don't think I'm religious myself, I don't think that religion necessarily has to be dogmatist and fundamentalist and militant and aggressive. But still, there's always a danger with belief systems, strong belief systems like religions. There's a danger of dogmatism and militancy and an unwillingness to acknowledge fallibility. That happens when people turn to politics and ideology in their search for meaning. So that kind of dogmatism that is sometimes associated with the bad forms of religion, I now see among a lot of students on campuses who find their meaning in advocating for identity politics and what they call social justice and so forth.
Well, I certainly agree that when people talk about religious extremism, they're talking about people who are exhibiting psychological tendencies toward extremism that can be exhibited in a number of contexts, including religious contexts. I mean, I think the psychology of tribalism is generic. There are a lot of people who don't believe that, who think that the root cause of religious extremism is believing in the religious ideas.
Stalin disproved that, and Hitler disproved that. But yeah, there's still people who do believe it. Now, I have a disagreement on an aspect of this issue with someone who I almost always agree with when it comes to academic issues, and that's Alan Kors. Do you know Alan Kors, the professor of history at...
I know of him. He was at Penn. I once listened to a course of his back before the internet. I paid for one of these series of audio cassettes. Oh, yeah. It was on Western intellectual history. He's a very good lecturer. Yeah,
he's a brilliant scholar and a brilliant lecturer. He's really an historian of the Enlightenment and more particularly of atheism. But in any event, this is not a debate about his academic field. It's a debate about what is causing the militancy and dogmatism among so many on the progressive side on campuses these days. And Alan believes, well, he and I debated each other on this topic on NPR a few years ago. Alan believes that the problem has something to do with progressivism itself and the nature of progressivism. He thinks it's by nature more tribal, it's by nature more militant, it's more by nature more dogmatic. And my counterproposal is that it actually doesn't have to do with progressivism itself as an ideology or worldview. It has to do rather with human nature. It's not a problem of an ideology, it's a problem of human nature. All of us are prone to falling in love with our own opinions and convictions. All of us are fall into the temptation to be dogmatic, not to recognize that we could be wrong. All of us yield sometimes to the temptation not to listen to other people who challenge our views, especially when there are deeply held, really cherished, even identity-forming views. You know, we don't want them to be challenged. We don't like it when people unsettle us like that. And my argument, my claim against Alan is that will happen and will be exacerbated whenever any ideology has a monopoly or something close to a monopoly. If it were conservatives in the same position that liberals are in or people on the left are in academic institutions today, we'd be just as bad. We'd be prone to the same dogmatism, to the same unwillingness to entertain competing points of view, to the same discrimination and prejudice against scholars who apply for jobs at our institutions who dissent from our orthodoxies. From a Christian point of view, I'd say it's original sin. It's something in human nature. And I think the way to combat it so Alan thinks the way to combat it is to combat progressivism. I think the way to combat it is to prevent any one side from getting a viewpoint monopoly in educational institutions. What you really need are people who genuinely disagree, reasonable, well-informed, well-disposed people who disagree to get into a classroom together, or at least be on a campus together so students can attend this guy's class and that guy's class, attend my class and attend Peter Singer's class, or attend Cornell West's class and attend my class, and hear the competing points of view. The best possible thing is to get them in the same room together. So when Cornell and I are co-teaching our seminars, that's the best thing. That's an expensive way to do education. Not all institutions are going to be able to afford that. But I think all institutions can make a point of trying to hire the best people they can get representing different points of views, the very top points of view, the very top people, and make sure that students have opportunities to hear them in classrooms.
Yeah, it sounds like in some ways Alan Kors is to ideology what Sam Harris is to religion. That's actually in some ways a misleading analogy, but in both cases, I think they fail to appreciate what you're saying. I agree with you that underlying this all is a common human nature. And I suspect that, I mean, you certainly can't say we don't see a lot of right-wing tribalism. It's just that, Trump's base is full of tribalism. It's just that there aren't so many of them on college campuses because they're less likely to go to college. But this leads us kind of to another question that you get into. I know you did in your congressional testimony, which is, the fact that for a long time now, faculties at least have been more left than right. There's been more left relative to the populace.
Yeah.
It seems like with student bodies, there's been a little more fluctuation. Right now, there seems to be, at least in terms of where the energy is, it's on the left. But do you have a theory as to why, for so long, faculties have been left of center? I mean, one theory I've heard is, they're very well educated, very smart people, so they see the light. I assume that's not your explanation.
Yeah, I can't help chuckling, but I do hear that from time to time, and it I think is it's reflective of the problem. When you're in the echo chamber, that's the kind of thing it's the kind of story you tell yourself and tell each other, and pretty soon you start believing it. But as soon as people get even a little bit self-critical and self-aware, they realize that that's not true. There's another theory that I like that I think is funny, and that's the theory that, people on the right really like money. And so they're drawn to professions like law, or they're drawn to business, or they're drawn to medicine, where people can make a lot of money. People on the left are not so motivated by money. So they're drawn to academia, where there's not a lot of money, but you get to consider ideas and do teaching and scholarship and so forth. I encourage anybody who is tempted to believe that theory for a millisecond to talk to any department chairman of any department at any university about their interaction with their own faculty members when it comes to annual evaluations and raises. Nobody's more aggressive about money than academics. You know, Bob, it's not the case that academics were always or are always tending more toward the progressive side. You know, there have been periods of English history when the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, for example, faculties were more conservative on the whole than the population. But certainly in our own lifetimes, university faculty have been to the left of the population generally. Things are now more, if you just look at data like party affiliation or self-identification along the ideological spectrum, things are more out of balance today than they were, say, in the 60s or 50s. But, you know, even then, as you rightly point out, there was a substantial majority of liberals. The Heterodox Academy, again, has done some research on this, and what their research shows is that what's happened is the number of conservative faculty has declined only a little bit. It was small to begin with, but it's declined only a little bit. Liberal faculty have gone way up, and that's because they've taken the moderates. There used to be a big moderate band between the conservatives and the people on the left. That band is now gone. That's a very narrow band now, and all the gains have been on the left side of the. And
that's happened over what period of time? Do you remember?
Gosh, you know, on the slide that they showed at the recent conference, it had the time frame, and I can't.
Because I mean,
but it's right. You know, it's in the last 25 years, roughly.
Because it mirrors what has gotten a lot of comment, you know, as it applies to America more broadly and American politics more broadly. You know, in Congress, you know, there's the center has kind of gotten hollowed out, and
oh, that's true. Actually, the parties have become more monolithic, more ideological. There are no more conservative Democrats. There are no more liberal Republicans. That's a fair point.
Yeah. So I see you're reorienting your camera there.
I'm plugging in my computer, my laptop, because I just noticed, I'm sorry about this, that my battery is dying. So I'm just going to plug it in here, Bob.
That's a good idea. Nice necktie, by the way. We're getting a very close-up view of that. That's nice.
That necktie is an Oxford necktie. That's the ox in the Oxford.
Oh, I didn't see it quite that finely. Now, I would say that your face is virtually invisible because you're against a very light background.
Okay,
now.
we're gonna we're gonna alter that. How's that? Is that better?
Yes, you're visible once again.
Well, I apologize to your viewers, Bob, for that.
They'd prefer that to your computer running out of energy, I think. So okay. We applaud that initiative. How, you know, the issue that's gotten so much attention about students who are so animated and motivated that they won't let people give, you know, public lectures about ideas they disagree with and so on, you know, so-called deplatforming. How widespread do you think that is? Because there is the argument that although there have been some well-publicized cases, and although student activism on the left is clearly more pronounced than it was 15 years ago, that there are a whole lot of college campuses where it's really not that much of an issue. I mean, I just gave a talk at a college you're probably familiar with because of its Catholic heritage, Marist.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Where a friend of mine is president now. I don't think they have any of that, pretty much, any of this. But is it, what's your view on that?
Well, first you have to look to see if any conservative or other dissenting speakers, libertarians or others, are being invited onto campus.
Okay.
If none are being invited onto campus, if the liberal lock is so strong on the campus that there are no student organizations that will invite in, you know, Ben Shapiro or anybody else on the conservative side, then you're not going to have an issue. I'll bet, I haven't done a rigorous study, but I'd be willing to put some money on this, that you'll find that a lot has to do with the number of conservative faculty members, out of the closet, prominent conservative faculty members you have on a campus. Where a campus has a decent representation of conservative faculty members, and students and other faculty members are accustomed to hearing conservative points of view and challenges from the conservative side every day in the normal course of things, it's not going to be a big deal when a conservative speaker from the outside comes in. Mm-hmm. Ben Shapiro comes in. Now, it will be if a lunatic like Richard Spencer comes, even the conservatives will be upset.
But that's the interesting question, is where the line is between Ben Shapiro and lunatic. Some people would say it isn't there. And no, but that's a perfect example, because he got into a lot of trouble for a tweet. I think I can quote it almost verbatim. It said, "Jews like to build stuff. Arabs like to live in sewage and blow stuff up. Settlements rock." And that was it. He may have said Israelis, but I think he said Jews. In any event, he said Arabs like to live in sewage and blow stuff up. That was it. That was the tweet. Yeah. No further context. Now, when he got blowback, he started kind of backpedaling. Although the next thing he said an hour later, after all the blowback, was, "Well, I just meant Palestinians." Well, Ben, that's still bigotry if you're talking about all Palestinians. But this is a very serious question, because if he had said about Jews or African Americans what he said about Arabs, I think he would have gotten into a lot more trouble, because, for one thing, there's more of an institutional infrastructure policing that kind of violation of speech code than there is in the case of Arabs. Although I know on the left there's a lot of energy about policing that. But I mean, seriously, like if someone uses the N-word in a derogatory way, not just like quoting Mark Twain or something, but they use it that way, I think I'm okay with my college deciding not to invite them to speak. But how different is that from what Ben Shapiro did? I mean, that seems to me not a trivially easy call.
Well, borderline issues are never easy. They're by definition hard. That's what a borderline issue is. I'm an Arab myself. My father's Syrian, so I don't like hearing stuff like what you just quoted. But do you suppose that if Jesse Jackson were invited onto a college campus, he would be deplatformed? Probably not, right?
No, and yet he said things, what, about Jews or what?
He said things every bit as bad as what Ben Shapiro said, or Al Sharpton, or right. Yeah. So I don't like that.
They're actually, yeah. I mean, their race kind of helps them oddly, given the politics on campus, and it might be that somebody else who had said what they said about Jews would be in more trouble. I don't know.
No, I don't know. But I mean, yeah. I wish everyone would. I don't want to stop people. In fact, I want to encourage people to be bolder and more outspoken about things they can defend with arguments. Mm-hmm. But I think people should be more cautious about sweeping, comprehensive statements that imply that all Arabs or all blacks or all white working class people or all Latinos do this or that or believe the other thing or have this fault or what have you. Here's my standard. I think we should not only tolerate but encourage on campus, both as regular members of the faculty and as visiting speakers, anybody representing any point of view who is prepared to do business in the proper currency of intellectual discourse. And that currency consists of evidence, reasons, and arguments. Now, as you can imagine, Bob, I'm not a guy who thinks infanticide is a good thing. I'm like really against infanticide. I'm against abortion too, but I'm really against infanticide. So does that mean I think Peter Singer, who argues, as you know, in favor of the moral permissibility of infanticide, not just in the case of children who are severely, ill and about to die or whatever, it's like euthanasia. I mean, he thinks that you're not a person until several months after you're born, and therefore it's not an offense against the child to kill the child. Now, I don't agree with that. But do you think I would think that Peter Singer should be deplatformed, should be thrown off our faculty, or not invited to speak on a college campus or something like that because of that? No, I don't think that at all. As scandalized as I am by his defense of killing newborn babies, the morality of killing newborn babies, I actually think it's great that Peter's here, and I've defended him, not just his right to freedom of speech, but the contributions he makes by defending a position that I find very disconcerting with reasons and evidence and arguments. And he forces me to think a lot more deeply and critically about why I'm opposed to infanticide. I've actually, I think, learned from having to formulate my responses to Peter's very serious criticisms of a position that almost everybody but Peter holds, and that is that you shouldn't kill newborn babies. So that's my standard. You know, I want Peter here. I don't want him deplatformed, even though he's advocating the morality of killing an entire class of people, newborn babies.
Well, he's not, to be clear, he's not advocating killing all newborn babies.
No, he's saying that members of that class of people, newborn babies, can morally permissibly be killed.
Right. In cases where they are born with such physical deficiencies that...
Nope. That's not Peter's view. Peter will be the first to tell you that is not his view.
What is his view?
His view is that you have done no injustice to killing even a fully healthy newborn baby before it becomes a person. If the parents, for their own reasons, whether the baby has anything wrong with it or not, want to kill the baby, maybe to try for a different baby, or maybe with different traits or what have you, there's nothing actually morally wrong. Now, it might be morally wrong for me to kill your baby, but the offense there is not against the baby. It's no injustice to the baby. Right. It's an injustice to the parents. But if the parents themselves, if there's nobody beyond the baby who's being victimized here, it's not wrong to kill the baby. That's actually Peter's position. And you know what? He makes some pretty darn compelling arguments for it about what gives us dignity as persons. He thinks it's not simply the root capacity for rationality and self-awareness and judgment and deliberation and choice. He thinks it's the actual realized capacity for those things, the immediately exercisable capacity for those things. That's a challenging position, but he defends it with reasons and arguments, and therefore I want it to be heard.
And I would say, since he's not here to defend himself, I think a large part of his motivation for even getting into that argumentative terrain and making these kinds of arguments is his perception that it sometimes happens that children who are doomed to a very low quality of life can only be kept alive for the rest of their lives at great expense. And in some cases, their parents may not even want them to be alive. But in any event, his point would be the resources devoted to that could be used to save 50 kids in Africa or whatever. I mean, he does emphasize that, but I take it that you're right about what the substance of his eventual argument is.
I can tell you that I'm right because I have it from Peter. When Peter was hired at Princeton, I was a member of the faculty. I remember this very well. When Peter was hired at Princeton, there was an uproar. Steve Forbes, who was a member of the Board of Trustees at the time, announced that he wasn't going to give another dime to Princeton because they hired an advocate of infanticide. The administration of Princeton then rushed in to defend its decision to hire Peter, saying that, well, he argues for infanticide, but only in the case of children who are born with severe defects and who will have terrible lives and be in pain and so forth. And Peter, to his credit, corrected them and said, no, you've misunderstood my argument. That's not my argument. I don't think you're a person until you've achieved the immediately exercisable capacities for self-awareness and having desires, being aware of yourself as a continuing subject over time. I don't want to do Peter the injustice of trying to make his position more acceptable than it is. He's advocating, to his very great credit, a position that he knows is unacceptable even to people on the left.
I actually co-taught a graduate seminar with Peter. None of this came up because it was about something else. It was about the biological basis of moral intuition.
Yeah.
And I
just look at his book, Practical Ethics.
I have a lot of respect for him.
I do too.
Because of his consistency, his intellectual consistency. I mean, he's a thoroughgoing utilitarian, and not that this particular position is entailed in utilitarianism, but it represents the kind of difficult case that a lot of utilitarians kind of get squishy on. And Peter's just like, no, this is where my ideas lead. And also in lifestyle, he's very, of course, he is perhaps most famous as the intellectual leader of the animal rights movement going way back. And in his, dietary practices and so on, he walks the walk.
He gives away money, but not as much as by his own theory he should, but nevertheless more than most people do, and I think probably more than I do. We haven't compared notes on that. He's consistent there. He's actually not an animal rights advocate because as a utilitarian, he doesn't actually believe in rights, strictly speaking. So he does think that animals have a certain dignity that is violated ordinarily when we kill them or we.
I was thinking that in the book Animal Liberation, he actually used the term, but that's not.
No, he would be the first again to tell you that as a utilitarian, he doesn't use the language of rights in anything more than a very derivative sense, if he uses it at all. And actually, it was in a conversation that we had, a public conversation that we had, I believe, at Labyrinth Bookstore a couple of years ago, when I was talking with him about his then new book, a collection of short essays that actually op-ed pieces that had been published by Princeton University Press. He made the point that his position on the status of human beings in the earliest stages, in the embryonic and fetal and infant stages, was not actually dictated by his utilitarianism. It is dictated by a position that's kind of pre-utilitarian. The utilitarian calculus comes into play only when you decide who is to be counted. And to get counted, you have to be past the early infant stage to have the status of personhood to be counted in the utilitarian calculus. So what dictates it is not the principle of optimizing.
That seems to be at odds with his position on animals, because a 1-month-old baby presumably has as much sentience as an animal whose welfare he would be concerned about. And you would count the animal, right? He would count the turkey.
Yeah, but that's because he thinks that adult animals have a greater degree of self-awareness than newborn infants do.
Well, it depends on the animal. I can't believe.
Well, that's right. It would depend on the animal. He doesn't make a kind of general sweeping statement. It depends on the animals, but he thinks that there are animals, rabbits, dogs, lots of mammals, whose adult members of the species have more self-awareness, cognitive functioning than newborn infants. Now, of course, animals in the infant stage or in the embryonic or fetal stages, he wouldn't think have any more.
But in any event, I mean, he should at least think that he can eat shrimp or sardines. It seems to me, if his position is as you describe it,
I haven't talked to.
Is the amount of sentience that we attribute to like a 2-month, or what is it? What is the threshold? 1 month, 2 months? What is it?
Well, in an article in the English Spectator a number of years ago, he proposed the 28-day rule. He said that you should be able to kill a newborn infant, again, whether or not it's suffering from disease or anything, up to 28 days. And he said that was a cautious position, because he was quite sure that you weren't a person until well after 28 days. But just to be cautious, just to be sure we're not actually killing persons, there should be a 28-day limit. Now, he later, as I understand it, withdrew that 28-day proposal, and I don't think he has given an alternative number of days or weeks or months or what have you. But that was what he initially argued in the piece in the Spectator.
By the way, if he's willing
the piece is entitled, for those who want to look it up, it's available online. It's Peter Singer, and the piece is called "Killing Babies Isn't Always Wrong," and it's in the English Spectator, not the American Spectator, not Bob Tyrrell's magazine, but the English magazine called The Spectator.
So have you discussed and debated this with him publicly?
Oh, yeah.
Matt Labyrinth?
Yeah, we had a very good forum a few years ago that involved not only Peter and myself, but our colleagues Liz Harmon from the philosophy department here, John Haldane from the philosophy department of the University of St. Andrews, my colleague and friend co-author Patrick Lee. I think there were 6 of us debating. It was a really sustained. It was a whole afternoon of debating these issues, and because we had a group of us, it wasn't just 2 positions. I mean, there were the spectrum of positions on these life issues. So
if he's willing to discuss it with you on this very platform, would you be willing down the road?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's tell me something. There's a lot of complaint from the kinds of from some of the same from the kinds of people who are complaining about some of the things you're complaining about. There's a lot of complaint about like postmodernism and Marxism, or postmodern Marxism, and I'm wondering, do you think that this is a big thing of Jordan Peterson, who's part of this intellectual dark web thing that I know you're not that conversant in, but has gotten a lot of attention and is not unrelated to this. Ben Shapiro, for example, is apparently a member in good standing of the intellectual dark web. But do you think that that's a big part of the what you see as the problem? I mean, postmodernism, perhaps with its suggestion that there's no truth or whatever.
No, not necessarily. Of course, I don't know, as you say, I don't know a lot about the intellectual dark web. From what I gathered, some people on the left and some people on the right, it's not a right-wing thing or an ideological thing. There's Brett Weinstein is a member of it. He's on the left. He supported Bernie Sanders. Ben Shapiro's on the right. I think Glenn Lowry might be a member of it.
Glenn is on the margins. It's not clear whether he's been inducted, but
yeah, I don't know enough about it really to say very much about it. But if the question is, if postmodernism is all about the denial of truth, then I think there is such a thing as truth, and so I would challenge postmodernism if it denies truth. The problem we have on campus today isn't so much the denial of truth. It's the assertion that one side knows the truth, and it has the right to impose it and to brook no dissent. I mean, in fact, it seems to be a return to the old idea that only the truth has rights, only the right position on affirmative action or abortion or homosexuality or whatever, that only the so-called correct position, the politically correct position, is entitled to be advocated. So I don't think our problem right now is subjectivism or relativism on campus. It's an absolutism. It's the opposite of relativism. It's the belief that we are so secure in our knowledge of certain truths that we can legitimately shut down, and ought to shut down advocacy of points of view that challenge those truths.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this, and here I'm not asking about any kind of, activism that goes beyond acceptable bounds. I'm just talking about the fact that on college campuses, faculties especially, yes, they are left of center, certainly relative to the population at large. So there is a kind of a leftward tilt. But let me ask you this. I mean, don't they wind up losing in the end? And here's what I mean. Or couldn't we see them as kind of counterbalancing a place where there is, if anything, a rightward tilt? And there, I mean, where policy actually gets made, because money carries tremendous influence in the political space. And so certainly, if you want to see where a lot of the power is over ideas at the point where they're getting translated into policy, look at who's funding the think tanks in Washington. And I think you'll notice a couple of things, like foreign policy is far from a leftist dream. The range of debate in Washington is by and large between liberal interventionism and neoconservatism. It's almost like the argument is over how should we justify this next military intervention, right? And I mean, that's a slight oversimplification. In the realm of domestic policy, there certainly has been leftward movement. I mean, the Great Society was leftward and so on. On the other hand, I think there was a time in like mid 20th century when the highest tax rate was 90% or something, right? And the drift of tax policy, it seems to me, has been steadily, erratically, but on balance, more and more favorable to rich people. So the point is just like, wouldn't you say that where the rubber meets the road, in kind of think tanks, in Washington policymaking circles, the tilt is, if anything, toward the opposite? And in a way, maybe what this underscores is the ultimate impotence of ideas in the pure sense, or of academia.
Well, I would scarcely say that conservatism is the dominant, at least as I understand conservatism, and the conservatism I represent is scarcely the dominant position in our politics. Nor is it the dominant position among the affluent, the most affluent, the wealthiest, the elite sector of the culture. Trump himself represents a challenge to that dominance of foreign policy discussions by liberal interventionists and neoconservatives. If they agree on anything, if you want to bring Samantha Power and Max Boot together, just say the word Donald Trump, and they'll both start booing and hissing. So there's the first real challenge I think we've had in a very long time to what I think you rightly say has been the dominant axis of discussion between liberal interventionists, which Hillary Clinton actually represented,
absolutely,
and neoconservatives, which I think did have a very strong presence, the whip hand in the Bush administration. As far as economic power, I recall not long before he became vice president, Mike Pence supported a really rather anodyne, mundane religious liberty bill in Indiana. And the left was able to bring the power of the nation's major corporate, Google, Microsoft, NCAA, NBA, NFL, down like the wrath of God on Indiana to stop that bill from going through. Same thing with the so-called bathroom bill in North Carolina. And if you look at the actual policies on social issues and the giving of our major corporations and the wealthiest Americans, and if you look at who's got the real wealth as far as philanthropic corporations are concerned, or for that matter, even think tanks, the conservatives are pretty well represented in the think tank world. The liberals are as well, actually. Brookings is larger and more influential than AEI, richer. But if you look at the Bradley Foundation,
on foreign policy, I wouldn't say Brookings represents an exception to what I'm talking about. But I take your point.
But CFR does, right? I mean, Council on Foreign Relations would be a dominant liberal. I mean, I beg to differ.
Max Boot, Elliot Abrams, their most prominent people are neocons. I mean, the people you most often see on TV who are subsidized by CFR are neocons.
I would be willing to bet well, certainly this is an easy one. The overwhelming majority of CFR people voted for Hillary Clinton. I'll bet that was 80-20.
Well, it depends on what you mean by people. If you mean members, sure, but they don't have any influence. The people who have influence are the fellows they hire.
Let's do the fellows. I mean, I'll bet that's true. And I'll bet that's true even in Bush against Gore or Bush against Kerry. I'll bet the fellows were 60-40 at least. Voting for
but again, I would say the ones who aren't neocons are by and large liberal interventionists. I can think of one example, Mike Azinko. There may be others, but I just think CFR represents the very narrow range of discourse that I alluded to earlier.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I mean, it's not conservatism. Conservatives do not. I mean, it was a big deal when because I'm a conservative. It was a big deal that I was elected to CFR. Because there are just not that many conservatives in the Council on Foreign Relations.
Because you're a Buchananite conservative?
No, I'm not a Buchananite conservative.
Well, in some ways you are, aren't you?
No, I'm definitely not.
Well, no, you're not. You're not nativist.
No, I'm not. You know what I am?
What are you? Are you a Burkean conservative?
Yeah. Well, I certainly think well of Burke, who, remember, was not a conservative. He was not a Tory. Burke was a Whig. Burke was an old-fashioned liberal, and that's what American conservatives like me are. I would have said American conservatives, and I now have to add like me because conservatism has morphed into a more complex thing. But what American conservatives used to be and what I am are simply old-fashioned liberals. We're Madisonian, Tocquevillian liberals. We believe in the rule of law, separation of powers, federalism, Republican government, the market economy, traditional moral values. Those were what conservatives were, and they were to be distinguished from European conservatives. European conservatives were throne and altar or blood and soil conservatives. Well, there's not much throne and altar conservatism around, but blood and soil is coming back, and I don't like it. And that's what I don't like about Buchanan and the nativists. That kind of blood and soil nationalism is not, to me, what American conservatism represents.
Right. So you're not protectionist.
You're old-fashioned Madisonian, Tocquevillian liberals.
Right. So
we believe in civil society. We're civil society conservatives.
So you're not nativist or economic nationalist, and those are the two parts of.
No, that's right. I'm pro-immigration.
Right.
You know, and the blood and soil nativists, the what do they call, ethno-populists or whatever they're calling them now, are really fundamentally anti-immigrant. Now, they're against illegal immigration, and I get that, and I think we should all be against illegal immigration. How we handle illegal immigrants in a humane way is a legitimate issue. But nobody, including people who come here unlawfully, is benefited by illegal immigration. Where I think the difference is that people like me strongly favor a generous legal immigration policy. I think legal immigration is good for the country. People like Buchanan think it's bad for the country.
And what about, do you characterize your views on foreign policy? I mean, you don't write about it. Do you have any? You don't have to disclose any views, but do you have a?
I wouldn't identify myself with a particular school like liberal interventionism or neoconservatism or anything like that. What I liked about the Reagan foreign policy was that it was human rights oriented. What Reagan represented, along with Democrats like Henry Jackson, was a foreign policy that took seriously, for example, the need to pressure the Soviet Union to release Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the country, for example. Human rights pressure. So I served for 4 years from 2012 to 2016 on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was chairman of the commission for 2 terms. And what I lobbied very powerfully for, as powerfully as I could for, with our State Department when I was serving as chairman of the commission, was for a foreign policy that brought pressure to bear on countries, especially those allied with us, like Saudi Arabia, to adopt much more humane policies toward religious minorities like the Ahmadiyya Muslims, toward atheists, toward people who dissented from the majority religion, whether the majority religion was Hindu, as in the case of the Hindu nationalists in India, or Sunni Muslim, as in the case of Saudi, or Shiite Muslim, as in the case of Iran, or Buddhist, as in the case of Myanmar, where the Muslim minority, the Rohingya Muslim minority, is discriminated against and really quite brutally treated by the Buddhist majority. So I want a foreign policy that does promote American values, especially freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of journalists to report, these kinds of things. I'm for that. Now, having said all that, Bob, I get it that we cannot be the world's policeman. We can't solve all problems. But look, we're a rich, powerful nation. We have a lot of influence. What influence we have in foreign affairs, let's use it for our basic old-fashioned liberal values.
Okay. So I have, I mean, I guess we've been at this a while. I should wrap this up before long. I have a couple of other questions. And I should say, I mean, in reference to just this last, my last point, I think you're right that in a lot of ways we've been drifting left. I think that's partly, I mean, because in a lot of ways, the moneyed classes, that's fine with the moneyed classes, I think. But when it comes to things like tax cuts, it's kind of a different matter.
That's right.
But in some ways, you know, the corporate class is very happy with a leftward drift on lifestyle and all that.
Yep. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So a couple of things. First of all, I noticed okay, so this is from this congressional testimony you gave. Now, what committee was this? This was the name of the testimony was, "Is there a cure for campus illiberalism?" It was this spring. What committee was this before?
I believe it was called the Government Reform Committee, Government Oversight Committee. Sorry, Government Oversight Committee.
Okay, so you're talking about what you call the unwillingness of so many members of college, university communities to entertain or even listen to arguments that challenge the opinions they happen to hold. Whether the opinions have to do with, and here's your list: climate science, affirmative action, and racial or ethnic preferences, abortion, welfare policy, marriage, and sexual morality, U.S. foreign and defense policy, the international economic order, and then this is the one that got my attention, or the origins of human consciousness. I'm not aware of a lot of people being deplatformed on the basis of their views on the origins of human consciousness. I'm just wondering what you had in mind.
I have in mind the reaction that Thomas Nagel received for his book. You know, suddenly he's regarded as some fundamental, as it happens, Nagel's an atheist, but he's regarded as some kind of a fundamentalist or a person who has given aid and comfort to the enemy because he questions some points on which there's an established orthodoxy.
Yeah, that's interesting, because what I think Thomas Nagel is a great thinker. Now, what got him in trouble was this last book. I forget what it was called, but he did depart from, you know, Darwinian dogma in the sense of saying that there was something about human beings that natural selection could not account for, something about their depth of cognitive development or something. Now, I feel convinced that particular view is based on a mistake. I think maybe I could talk him out of it. That said, when I read that book or actually listened to it, I just had the feeling this is a great mind at work. I mean, he's one of the leading philosophers of our time. The questions he was asking and the questions that led him to wonder about things like this are so profound and just well framed. And it bothered me too that he was. I know Steve Pinker gave him a lot of trouble. You know, there was a tweet that almost suggested that Nagel had gone crazy, and that's an extreme characterization of tweet. But it wasn't. I didn't think it was very charitable. And I think one thing that gets Nagel into trouble sometimes is the idea that he's departing from materialism. But I think, I just think Nagel appreciates what a profound problem consciousness is. And
But look, I mean, here, this is an example. People get really attached to our view. We fall in love with our convictions. Now, in a way, that's good. I mean, it's good that we wrap our emotions tightly around our convictions, because as a result of that, people will do things. I mean, they'll get work done. They'll research a project. They'll fight for true justice. They'll do all kinds of things because our emotions are tightly wrapped around our convictions. But if we wrap our emotions too tightly around our convictions, then we become dogmatists. And at that point, whenever we hear a view challenged, we take it as a personal insult. Or we imagine that only a person who's either a bigot or a fool could challenge this view. We integrate our views into our very identities. And so we really take offense and question the good faith of anybody who challenges them. We got to get past this, Bob. I mean, look, the world is a really complicated, really fascinating, really interesting place. Almost no interesting question has an obvious answer. Yeah. And, we should be open to anybody who's got a mind like Tom Nagel's who wants to challenge us on anything.
No, I agree. I mean, I've been thinking for some time that the psychology of tribalism is a big problem. That's become more evident later. I actually started something called the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which will resume publication in September, and it's on summer break. But it's about combating Trumpism without becoming an example of it in a certain sense, without becoming counterproductively tribalistic about it, which I think a lot of the resistance is.
Yeah, one of the finest academic people I know. He's actually the president of a university. I won't out him here by revealing his name, which the fact that that's a concern at all tells you something. But let me tell you something that he took me to lunch in December of 2016 to tell me. And remember, he's a conventional academic liberal, really smart guy, comes out of the field of law himself, so we had that in common. This is when most academic people are in a total freak out about Trump. Total freak out. He said to me, I didn't realize this before. I've never really admitted this, but I now see that we live in the echo chamber. We really do live in a bubble. What conservatives say is true. And the reason I've come to believe this is none of us saw the election of Trump coming. None of us thought it was possible. And the reason that none of us saw it coming and none of us thought it's possible is that we are out of touch with millions, literally millions of our fellow citizens. We don't understand their concerns, their beliefs, their fears, their hopes, their values, their aspirations, and they don't understand ours. And he said, Robby, that can't be good for the academic world. It can't be good for, he named his own institution, and it can't be good for the country. So I think mindfulness, you don't have to be pro-Trump. Neither you nor I is pro-Trump. You don't have to be pro-Trump, but you need to be mindful in, if you want to use the word resistance, in the resistance or in your criticism. Mm-hmm. You want to let him drive you crazy to freaking out.
Right. No, we are on the same page. I hope we'll be able to continue the discussion about this and about what to do about it down the road. Final question. You said in your congressional testimony, Princeton actually doesn't have that hostile a climate. You said Princeton's not really a good example of the problem, but you said the university has received a threat because of your ideas, although you've never been threatened by a student, and also that you had been threatened by someone outside of the university who apparently was prosecuted for this or something. But
he went to jail, sir. Yeah. He's sentenced to 4 years in jail. He got out after 2.5.
And what were the issues that got you? What positions of yours got you into the trouble?
My pro-life view.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Robby. And
it's a pleasure, Bob. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. And let's continue the conversation.
Good. Thanks for noticing my headlights weren't on.
Least I could do.
Okay, Bob.